Hello, and welcome to Relaxing Facts. I'm Chad Kay, and today I will be talking about the American abolitionist Frederick Douglass. Each week, I share interesting stories and little-known facts on a variety of topics, accompanied by gentle, soothing music. My goal is to help you find a sense of calm during your busy day. Feel free to settle into a cozy spot and let yourself be carried away by these relaxing facts. Frederick Douglass was born into slavery in Maryland in 1818, though he never knew the exact date of his birth. Like many enslaved people, that information was never recorded for him. He grew up on a plantation on the eastern shore of Maryland, separated from his mother at a very young age. This separation was common in slavery and was meant to weaken family bonds and make control easier. Douglass rarely saw his mother, and she died when he was still a child. His father was believed to be a white man, possibly the plantation owner himself, which was also a tragically common reality of slavery in the United States. As a young boy, Douglass was sent to Baltimore to live with a ship carpenter named Hugh Auld and his wife Sophia. This move would change his life in a profound way. Sophia Auld initially treated Douglass with kindness and began teaching him the alphabet. But when her husband discovered what she was doing, he quickly ordered her to stop. He insisted that teaching an enslaved person to read would make him unfit to be a slave. Ironically, hearing this was a turning point for Douglass. He later wrote that in that moment he understood that education was a pathway to freedom. Douglass became determined to learn to read and write, even though it was illegal and dangerous. He cleverly found ways to continue learning. He befriended poor white boys in the neighborhood and traded bread for reading lessons. He studied newspapers, signs, and books whenever he could. Over time, he taught himself not only how to read, but also how to think critically about the world around him. Through reading, he began to understand the injustice of slavery more deeply. He encountered speeches and writings about liberty and human rights, which strengthened his desire for freedom. However, this new awareness also brought pain. Douglass later described how education opened his eyes to the cruelty of his situation. The more he learned about freedom, the more unbearable slavery became. Still, he refused to give up hope. As a teenager, Douglass was sent to work for a farmer named Edward Covey, who had a reputation as a slave breaker. Covey was known for brutally beating enslaved people in order to crush their spirit and force obedience. During this period, Douglass endured severe physical abuse and exhaustion. For months, he was pushed to his limits. One day, after being whipped repeatedly, Douglass decided he would resist. When Covey tried to beat him again, Douglass fought back. The two struggled for nearly 2 hours. Covey eventually gave up, and Douglass was never whipped by him again. Douglass later described this moment as a turning point in his life. He said the fight rekindled his sense of manhood and self-respect. Though he was still enslaved, he felt that his spirit had not been broken. Douglass attempted to escape slavery several times. His first attempts failed, and the consequences could have been deadly. But he never abandoned the dream of freedom. Finally, in 1838, at the age of 20, he successfully escaped. Disguised as a sailor and carrying borrowed identification papers, Douglass traveled by train and boat from Maryland to New York. The journey was incredibly risky. If he had been discovered, he would have been returned to slavery and likely punished severely. When he arrived in New York, Douglass later wrote that he felt both joy and uncertainty. He was free, but he was also alone and vulnerable in an unfamiliar place. Soon afterward, he reunited with Anna Murray, a free black woman who had helped support his escape. The two married and moved to New Bedford, Massachusetts, where Douglass began building a new life. In New Bedford, Douglass worked as a laborer and became involved in the abolitionist movement, which sought to end slavery in the United States. At first, he simply attended meetings and listened to speakers. But in 1841, at an anti-slavery convention, he was invited to share his own experiences as a formerly enslaved person. His speech stunned the audience. Douglass spoke with powerful clarity about the realities of slavery and the moral urgency of ending it. Soon afterward, he became a lecturer for the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. Douglass traveled across the northern U.S., telling audiences about the brutality of slavery and advocating for abolition. His powerful voice, sharp intellect, and commanding presence made him one of the most influential speakers of his time. However, some people doubted his story. They could not believe that a man who spoke so eloquently had once been enslaved. To answer these doubts, Douglass published his autobiography in 1845, titled Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. The book described his life in vivid detail and exposed the cruelty of slavery to a wide audience. The narrative became an immediate bestseller and helped turn Douglass into an international figure. But it also created danger. Because he revealed the names of the people who had enslaved him, he could legally be captured and returned to slavery under U.S. law. To avoid this risk, Douglass traveled to Britain and Ireland for nearly 2 years. During his time abroad, Douglass gave speeches and built support for the abolitionist cause. Many people in Britain were deeply moved by his story. Eventually, supporters there raised money to legally purchase Douglass's freedom, ensuring he could safely return to the United States. When Douglass returned to America, he settled in Rochester, New York, and founded his own newspaper called the North Star. The paper's motto was powerful and direct. Right is of no sex. Truth is of no color. God is the Father of us all, and we are all brethren. Through the newspaper, Douglass spoke not only against slavery, but also for broader social reforms. One of the remarkable aspects of Douglass's life was how his activism extended beyond abolition. He became a strong advocate for women's rights, which was unusual at the time. In 1848, he attended the Seneca Falls Convention, the first major women's rights convention in the U.S. When some attendees hesitated to support women's right to vote, Douglass stood up and argued passionately in favor of it. His support helped push the resolution forward. Throughout the 1850s, tensions over slavery in the U.S. continued to grow. Douglass became increasingly outspoken, criticizing laws such as the Fugitive Slave Act, which required escaped enslaved people to be returned to their enslavers, even if they had reached free states. Douglass also began to believe that slavery might only end through conflict rather than peaceful persuasion. When the American Civil War began in 1861, Douglass strongly supported the Union cause. He believed the war must be fought not just to preserve the nation, but to end slavery permanently. Douglass urged President Abraham Lincoln to allow black men to serve as soldiers in the Union Army. Eventually, the Union did begin recruiting black soldiers, including the famous 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment. Douglass helped recruit soldiers for the regiment, and 2 of his sons enlisted. He argued that military service would prove the courage and citizenship of black Americans and strengthen the case for equal rights. Douglass later met with Lincoln at the White House, where he pushed for fair treatment and equal pay for black soldiers. Though the 2 men did not always agree, Lincoln respected Douglass's insight and moral clarity. When the Civil War ended in 1865 and slavery was abolished through the 13th Amendment, Douglass celebrated the victory, but also warned that the struggle for equality was far from over. He continued advocating for the rights of newly freed African Americans during the Reconstruction era. Douglass supported the 14th and 15th Amendments, which granted citizenship and voting rights to black men. However, he also witnessed the rise of violent opposition in the South and the emergence of segregation and discrimination. Despite these setbacks, Douglass never stopped fighting for justice. Later in life, Douglass held several government positions, including serving as U.S. Marshal for the District of Columbia and later as U.S. Minister to Haiti. These roles reflected how far he had come, from someone born enslaved to a respected national leader. Even into his later years, Douglass remained an active speaker and writer. His speeches continued to challenge Americans to live up to their ideals of freedom and equality. One of his most famous speeches, delivered in 1852, asked a powerful question: "What to the slave is the 4th of July?" In it, Douglass pointed out the painful contradiction between America's celebration of liberty and the continued existence of slavery. Frederick Douglass died in 1895 at the age of 77. By the time of his death, he had become one of the most important voices for freedom and human rights in American history. And that brings us to the end of this week's talk. If you enjoyed this episode of Relaxing Facts, then please consider subscribing, leaving a comment, or clicking the like button. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, whether you're taking a moment to unwind or simply enjoying some calming listening. Thank you very much for being here. I am Chad K, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye.